Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to the Post 17, Silence. This post is part of a trilogy that I've nicknamed the Fightback Trilogy. We start with silence. Our second component is titled Outside the Tent, and we finish off with creating a meaningful life. Now, there are many triggers for this series, but the first is an array of messages, and I'm talking thousands of messages that I've received from you. And these messages are of a different order than when I was a Dean of Graduate Research. Let me explain. These emails are filled with fear, despair, fair amount of disgust, which is interesting, and also real concern about the future. So from this inspirational, powerful, and also quite disturbing array of messages, I commence this particular trilogy. But there's also a couple of triggers that have really sharpened it, so we need to go into this issue now. Firstly, a great mate of mine is applying for promotion from lecturer to senior lecturer. To be frank, she's already working at a professorial level, but unbelievably in the past, her promotion was knocked back. And so she was about to apply again. But this year, the university changed the rules for promotion. They made an arbitrary decision, I would argue, to only use Scopus for citations to assess whether or not someone is worth promotion in research. So not only is research funding not enough, but the committee is going to be assessing how that money was used. So value judgments, subjectivity about how a grant is used, while of course always institutional grants, whatever that institution, has a series of benchmarks, protocols and transparency within it. But that's not enough. No, the committee is going to make a determination about whether or not the money has been spent properly. Oh yeah. And the only way, supposedly, as the chair of this promotion committee stated, the only way to prove one's worth beyond Scopus citations and the value of how one had spent their money was to win a Nobel Prize. Now, just a reminder, we're talking about promotion from lecturer to senior lecturer. Now, my friend has well over $1 million in grants, but this chair now wants to make sure that it's being used properly. Wow. Now, my friend works in the social sciences and the humanities, as do I, but you all know I have profound respect for all disciplines, whether it's engineering, right the way through to art and design, theology, philosophy. I believe in experts, I believe in expertise, I believe in the comprehensive university. But the problem is that Scopus actively marginalises and indeed erases about half the disciplines in our universities because it rarely includes books or book chapters. And this is not me saying this, a humble social scientist. It's not me saying this. Let me quote the comparative research from Information Science. All this was a brilliant study from Martin, Orduna Malaya, Thewal, Lopez Cozar. And they published this work in 2018 with some amazing dissemination through 2019 that I'll link you to in our reference list at the end of this post. But what these remarkable scholars did is they enacted a comprehensive and comparative analysis of Scopus, Web of Science, and Google Scholar. And they reported, hang on to yourself, quote, the results by broad areas showed that Google Scholar was able to find most of the articles in the social sciences, 94%, while Web of Science and Scopus found 35 and 43% respectively. Moreover, Google Scholar appeared to be a superset of Web of Science and Scopus, as was able to find 93% of the citations found in Web of Science and 89% of the citations found in Scopus. Last but not least, over 50%, over 50% of citations to social science articles were only found in Google Scholar. End of quote. Wow. So this study also confirmed that Google Scholar incorporated research published in languages other than English. So with all the attention in our universities on internationalisation and globalisation, how about we think about research published in languages other than English? All this talk about globalisation, therefore, why would any of us make a logical, rational decision to ignore Google Scholar, let alone ignore it for promotion? So let me give you an example so you know that you're not alone in this pretty bizarre situation. I've published 20 books, over 250 refereed articles. Now, I focus on platinum open access journals, and in the last couple of years I've been very focused on publishing outside of Europe and outside of the North American publishing system. And I also have some nitros, non-traditional research outputs. Cool. Now, my Google Scholar is 4 times my Scopus level. Now, I know Google Scholar is a bit higher for everyone. Just to give you a comparison, my wonderful husband, Professor Jamie Quinton, his Google Scholar is about 4.5–5% higher than Scopus. Okay, so whenever anyone starts with this Scopus stuff, please feel free to use my example. The books I write, single authored scholarly monographs from some of the best publishers in the world, those books are not in Scopus. But somebody who's written a 500-word review of the books in a journal that Scopus happens to have in their database, they're in Scopus. Okay, so you can see there's a real politics of citation going on here. And the idea that a promotion committee would exclude a citation system that is really the only citation system for about half the disciplines in our universities gives you a real sense of what's going on. And as to the Nobel Prize, well, of course, there firstly are no Nobel Prizes in the area in which my friend works. And let's be honest, why would a Nobel Prize be even mentioned by the chair of a promotions committee looking at applications going from lecturer to senior lecturer? Wow. Now, my friend and I talked about this situation, right? And my first instinct, as you know, because I want this for you, is get in there. Come on, girlfriend. Come on, let's do it. Let's get this application. I'll write you a reference. Let's do this. Come on, let's fight. Let's go for it. Come on. But then when I looked at the criteria for the assessment of the promotion, it is very, very clear that nobody from the humanities or the social sciences are actually going to be promoted. So applying makes a point, I suppose, but it wastes time that she now needs to be spending writing applications to get out of this Hotel California. Okay, so this trilogy sort of was born from this situation. What do you do and how do you think through this weirdness? But the final instalment, Summoning a Meaningful Life, is in response to a direct message in Twitter that absolutely left me in tears, and whenever I think about it, you can hear it now, I get very emotional. So this is a great scholar, completed his PhD, and he moved into industry. And he wanted to know, because he loved academic life, he loved research, and he wanted to know how any of us can actually stomach working in the university system, where dreadful people, his phrase, are rewarded and promoted, and they're rewarded and promoted for ripping off and hurting other people. Wow. Okay, so we're going to go there as well. And remember, that's the point. That's why we started this new series, colleagues. We wanted the post to be a space where the difficult thinking took place, the difficult arguments took place, and together we try and create alternatives. And we're doing this to make ourselves stronger, to improve all our systems, public, private, social, professional. So what do we do in a completely irrational situation where leaders have constructed truly bizarre and irrational rules, where there's no actual way to fight or question or challenge the system? And that's why we've started today, colleagues, with silence. Let's think about the power of silence to sit and start an opposition. Now, we've all been there. Happens to me a lot, can I say? It's particularly happened in the last couple of years or so. We're in a meeting, okay, and some third-rate random, often called the meeting, starts the meeting, and, you know, instead of going through, you know, hey, you got a meeting, particularly a Zoom meeting, go, hi, I'm Ralph, I'm Tony, I'm Narelle, I'm Raj, I'm Tara, hi, rock and roll. Instead of actually just sort of going around and introducing yourselves, which is how it used to be hashtag in the old days, about 18 months ago, we've got this third-rate random who starts the meeting by giving themselves their career narrative, so oversharing how fantastic they are and occupying about half the meeting time. Now, this problem is increasing, but instead of people just gently saying, hi, I'm Tara, and moving on, we've now got these third-rate randoms who are activating this monologue. Let me tell you about how amazing I am, how brilliant my career is. Let me tell you about my career highlights. And of course, why I'm so much better than you people. Now, of course, that narrative proves the exact opposite. They show they're a minor person with a minor career in a minor university, and nobody actually cares. The truth of my life, and I'm 53, okay? The truth of my life is the greatest scholars in the world, and I've had the great privilege to meet a few of them. The greatest scholars in the world never do this. They never do this. They allow their work, their research, their teaching, their community service to speak for themselves. But it's always difficult to know what to do in these situations, isn't it? If someone's doing this, what do you do? And, you know, they're going on with this narrative like the sort of Noam Chomsky at an anarcho-syndicalist conference, right? And now I simply, you know, you could do the same thing, but that's just pointless. So I now simply refuse to play this game. I sit in silence, I offer no commentary, I do not validate their response, and I don't make them feel comfortable in their delusion. So the silence, therefore, is a way to refocus the discussion on research, on ideas, on knowledge, rather than ego, power tripping, and of course, personal branding. Bless. So therefore, let's talk about the purpose and the value of silence in your life today, in tough times when you are confronted by weird situations and weird people. Now, COVID increased the visuality of our lives, but it also has increased the role of silence as resistance. Let me explain. Think about how many Zoom, Skype, Google Meets you've been in, Teams meetings you've been in, that we've experienced where someone is speaking and all the screens are off. All the microphones are off. It's amazing. So this group has completely disengaged and they're present, but they're not really present. They are disconnected and they're resisting through that disconnection. They're present, but they're absent. Wow. Okay. So digitization has allowed us to disconnect visually from our present. But what about sound? What about our oral life? Is our oral life different from our visual life? The cliche is, of course, seeing is believing. And that gives you a sense about how eyes, how visuality provide verification for us in our daily lives. Well, let's shake that truth up just a little bit. After the industrial revolution in the 18th and 19th century and the growth of urbanisation and cities, it was almost impossible to find silence. Silence is rare. And actually, the right to be silent is one of the greatest statements of power that we have. When noise and sound and stuff is everywhere, being silent is a confirmation of power and authority. But of course, silence remains defiant, but its meaning is not clear. Let me explain. Sivaram Vemuri in 2019 produced a powerful book that was titled Managing Silence in Workplaces. I recommend it to you. So for Vemuri, he locates, quote, the cost of silence, end of quote, and, quote, the need to manage silence, end of quote. Silence was an obstruction for Vemuri in managing a workplace. So for managers, silence is a problem. So why did he use such an argument? Well, he argued that silence kills inclusivity, it kills innovation, and it kills transformation in workplaces. Very interesting. So silence is a problem for our organisations and institutions. But the challenge is Vemuri assigned a meaning to silence. Silence is detrimental to workplaces, detrimental to productivity, detrimental to efficiency. It is a proxy for a lack of workplace engagement. Interesting. So Vemuri stated that, quote, silence is itself a form of communication, end of quote. But the point I want to make to you today is none of us, we cannot be certain ever what silence actually means. All the attention in our workplaces, including schools, including universities, is granted to the loudest people who voice their opinions. But how do we grant time and meaning to those who are silent? The answer is they are ignored. There are tangible and intangible costs for ignoring silence, and they include employee turnover, litigation, and also decreased productivity. So the way to think about silence configures us as humans as a source of economic growth. So we as humans, we are resources for business. Remember, human resources. But of course, we as humans, we are more than that. Silence, therefore, denies these functions and confirms that humans are a lot more than workers. Let me show you what I mean. Now, when I was 18 years old, yes, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I read Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. And I remember everything about the reading of it. It changed me. I can feel myself getting all tingly, remembering the first time I read it. And I always remember her phrasing on silence, quote, "For now she need not think of anybody. She could be herself by herself." And that was what she now often felt she was in the need of. To think, well, not even to think. To be silent, to be alone. All the being and doing, expansive, glittering, vocal, evaporated, and one shrunk with a sense of solemnity to being oneself, a wedge-shaped core of darkness, something invisible to others. And this self having shed its attachments, was free for the strangest adventures. End of quote. So as you can see, there is an ethics to silence, and the ethical questions of silence emerge when we avoid defining silence prescriptively. Now, what I mean is silence is deep, it's diverse, it's textured, and it's complex in its meaning. And those in power claim other people's silence and they give it a meaning. So they give silence a pejorative, prescriptive meaning. Right. Now, the point is that silence is ignored or it's marginalised most of the time. Silence is only seen and heard when we pay attention to it. In other words, unless we actually notice silence, it doesn't exist. As Bilius and Vermordi stated, quote, "Often silence is not noticed until it is too late." End of quote. So, if we don't place attention on silence and those who express it, there are some profoundly damaging consequences: depression, self-harm, resentment, anger, destructive work environments, suicide, and of course domestic violence. Our world is really noisy, lots of false, weird communication, information silos, echo chambers, and a hardening of viewpoints on the extreme right and the extreme left without any real evidence. So power operates through sound, through noise, through voice. Most famously, think about that weird phrase that emerges in courts of law, right? Silence in the court. Silence in the court. So silence has to be controlled so that power can speak. But this overt control suggests, doesn't it, that silence is pervasive, unpredictable, and troubling. Silence exists in spaces, and we talked about that last week. The thing is, of course, that most of the time we don't see spaces. We don't see that they exist, just like we don't hear silences, because our culture wants some nice, clean, easy binaries: black, white, straight, gay, male, female, student, supervisor, boss, worker. Now, of course, life is not like that. Meaning happens in the spaces. Silence happens in the spaces. The act of recognizing silence is important for many reasons, and I would argue it's incredibly significant for Indigenous communities, First Nations peoples, to historicise silence. So Bilius and Vermordi located 6 distinct modes of silence: insolent silence, silence of hopelessness, silence of the oppressed, silence of fear, silence of attentive listening, and silence which makes space for dialogue. Great analysis. But do you notice they missed out one key definition of science? Silence and resistance. Silence as resistance. So this resistance can be used to hold ground, to hold a position, to not give approval, to not give a particular person or particular situation respect. Now, this is what I've suggested to my friend who is applying, or indeed now not applying, for promotion. If we as educators, as leaders, as followers, as citizens can use attentive listening to understand silence, not to give it a prescriptive meaning, then we can have a more equitable, caring, and compassionate working environment. Silence certainly is a coping strategy for our present, but we have to remember that the voices of the marginalised, the disempowered, in the past, those voices have been lost to us. But we can acknowledge the silences of the past. We can create and hold a space for those silences in the past to be understood and to not grant it meaning. So, for example, for the historians out there, and of course my early training was history, if sources evidence is not available, because disempowered groups tend to not have evidence that survives through time, it's put in the dustbin of history, if you will, then we can at least acknowledge that there is no evidence present. The historical record is silent. We can acknowledge that, not give it a prescriptive meaning to the silence, but acknowledge that it exists. But of course, our current state, our current professional lives, personal lives, require a new type of refusal, require a new refusal to participate. But also this silence is important for us, I think, because it offers us a pause, a way to heal, a way to find an alternative pathway, a way to summon an alternative future. As Hall, Karabalis and Kirschbaum have confirmed, communication is situational, but quietness is important. If you think about it, language determines how we frame and understand our world. We speak our reality. Therefore, think about, how does silence frame and speak its reality? Language certainly is a way that we make sense of the world, but silence has a different role in the configuration of social relationships. We use speech to create, to maintain and transform interpersonal relationships, but silence matters as well. Think about the role of silence in relationship management or destruction. Silence can be a way to avoid pain and avoid trauma. Think about the phrase, the silent treatment. Yep, that's a way to respond to antagonism. Silence allows us to hold a moment, to place a relationship on hold until we as individuals have some sense of what's going on. But silence is also a critique, a statement that an individual will not participate in an injustice. When our experiences transcend our speech, we have to activate the work of silence and the world of silence. Maggie Ross described, and I love this phrase, quote, the simmering conflict between hierarchy and silence, end of quote. Speech is valued. Silence is suppressed. Therefore, we need to enable what Schaefer described as, quote, the recovery of positive silence, end of quote. Now, Raymond Murray Schaefer died on August 14, 2021. Therefore, it seems appropriate to summon and speak his name as we're nearing the 1-year anniversary of his death. Born in 1933, he moved the mind furniture of multiple scholarly generations through his World Soundscape project. So, studying a soundscape allows us to think about how sound alone creates our sense of place. Schaefer was a writer, he was a composer, and he was intensely interested in sonic ecology, connecting the maker of the sound with the meaning we gain from sound. He called on experimental music, particularly to create what he called ear cleaning, end of quote, and wanted to develop what he described magnificently as the thinking ear. For those of us who learn, who work in our universities, we are what Schaefer described as ear witnesses. We are ear witnesses to the changing relationships between information and knowledge, social justice and neoliberalisms and the very nature of work. We don't yet possess the sonic literacy, I would argue, to interpret fear, redundancy and loss through restructure after restructure after restructure, as colleagues are discarded, as expertise is marginalised. We don't have the sonic literacy to understand the decades, the generations of silence and inaction in response to sexual assault and sexual harassment of students and colleagues. We don't have the sonic literacy to understand the generations of research misconduct, where generation after generation after generation of students and scholars were added to papers or left off papers in which they had a great deal of interest or none. Research misconduct. How do we think? How do we speak those words of the past? But if we listen with consciousness, if we summon a thinking ear, we start to recognise the sound marks of our time. For those of you that are sick of fighting, sick to death of listening to absolute nonsense, sick of having to put up with people lacking expertise, sick of listening to complete and utter irrationality, silence offers a moment for you to stop, to pause, to reflect, and then restart. We're not offering respect or compliance to people that do not deserve it, at a time when talking and conversation and dialogue is not really possible anymore to respect. The restraint of silence becomes incredibly meaningful. It grants us a chance to assemble a different trajectory and indeed a different future. I wish you love, light and peace. Tea out.